Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I am live, as always, from John Favreau's living room. Leo is here. Pundit is here. Lovett is here.
Yo.
They will not be on today's episode. This week, I sat down with Heather Higginbottom, who is a longtime friend of the pod. She was the Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources, but she's a really interesting background in foreign policy because she came from doing domestic policy on the Hill. She was a campaign aide for President Obama, for Senator Kerry, and worked on a number of races, most of them with us. And her trajectory into working in foreign policy was very similar to mine. So I think you guys will be fascinated by her journey, impressed with what she's done, and will really enjoy the conversation. I am here with Heather Higginbottom, who has been my friend for a very long time. And Heather, I'm just going to read through your resume real quick because the theme of this show is I get to talk to people who are smarter than me, and they get to listen. Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources, Counselor to the U.S. State Department, Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Deputy Domestic Policy Council Director, Legislative Director for John Kerry. I'm just going to leave it there because I know you did all these campaigns and stuff, but that's a pretty good run. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. This is great. I'm so excited to be here. Friend of the pod.
Friend of the pod. I'm so excited to talk to you because the whole goal of the show is to help people get that they can understand and be a part of foreign policy and national security. And it is not reserved for PhDs or just like Fareed Zakaria. Yes, we're geeks and we get excited, but all you have to do is care and decide you want to be involved and you can be a part of these debates. And so what I think is so cool about your career is that you started as a policy person in the Senate, but you really cut your teeth on doing political campaigns. And I'm wondering if you tell us a little bit about some of those races, some of the some of the dark days from 2004, 2008, anywhere in between.
Absolutely. You know, what's interesting is not only did I really get going on the Hill, but it was all about domestic policy. You know, like I'd get to the foreign policy, the world affairs part of the paper, and I'd think, okay, that's not part of my job.
Right.
You know, and I look back now, especially in the last 4 years, and I'm like, this is not just part of my job. This is part of who I am.
Yeah.
This is part of who we need to be. And so it all started in that experience of being on the Hill and really becoming aware that you can influence policy and be a part of the conversation. And then the opportunity to join John Kerry's presidential campaign. And suddenly you're elevated from a narrow issue area in the Senate, which it was still amazing, but now you're like really shaping policy for an entire campaign. And the biggest thing about that, and it was certainly true in the Obama campaign, is suddenly you're all about communicating to the American people in a very important way. And so when you're in the Senate, it's about like policy and like tweaking bills and getting the right, legislation done. And then suddenly you're talking about policy as a way to communicate to the American people. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's what was so exciting about being on a presidential campaign, was saying, okay, these are things that are important, and now we get to really tell you why.
Right.
And why you should care about it, and why we should connect about it.
And you were policy director on both those races?
Deputy on Kerry's and policy director on Obama's, yeah.
Right. And so, I mean, what's so interesting about these campaigns is like the foreign policy, like most campaigns are won or lost on economic policy, right? Or really, let's be honest, like character issues, bullshit about your emails, like whether you got a private server. That's the number one issue in the hearts of Americans is
Swift
Gmail.
Boats.
Yeah, Swift Boats. Right. But the foreign policy issues that break through tend to be so narrow, right? Like it's like war, for or against. Big deal, obviously. Funding for the war. Benghazi. I'm just wondering, now that you've done all these races and you did the State Department and the White House, like, do you have a sense of how we could maybe try to have a smarter conversation about these things?
I've thought about this a lot. I think, first of all, you have to think about how you're reaching people. What conversation are you having with people? When you're just doing, as Barack Obama would say, who's up, who's down, if you're just in that back and forth on politics, you're not talking to people. You're not reaching them. So for me, the political conversation starts with how do you really have a dialogue? And then once you get into that dialogue, you can talk about like, what does it mean to protect this country? What does it mean to advance America's, role in the world? And what does it mean to be the leader in preventing and eradicating HIV/AIDS globally? And you start reaching people. But it's hard to get to that point in a political dialogue because so often it's scoring points. And that was, I think, particularly in the Obama campaign, such a big lesson of like, it's not just you have the right policy. It's not just, what's your communications plan? Like, do you have the way to reach people, to actually have a conversation? And I think once you get to that point, when you're really talking about, what do people care about? What do they see as the reflection of themselves and their politics? Then you can talk about foreign policy and these issues. But beyond that, it really is like almost like a litmus test, which doesn't get beyond, really like who's up or who's down.
Mm-hmm. So you moved over to state in 2013, right, to become counselor to Secretary Kerry. Did you feel armed and ready from your White House experience, OMB experience, or did you feel like a fraud like I did when I walked into the NSC meetings?
So funny. So when Kerry asked me to come over, it was a kind of a strange time because I had this important, significant role at OMB. And he said, come to the State Department and just help me figure out this transition. And I thought, well, I have the Senate confirmed job and I help write the budget and I'm in all the policy conversations. But he was pretty persuasive. And one of the things that persuaded me personally was I'd been in a meeting maybe the year before, and it was a deputies meeting at the National Security Council, and it had to do with Egypt and, the fallout of what was going on after the Arab Spring and how we would provide resources. That's why I was there from the foreign assistance side. And our ambassador, it was actually a principals meeting, and Secretary Clinton was there, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, SecDef, everybody was there. And our ambassador to Egypt, Ann Patterson, was up on the screen.
She was a badass.
Badass. And
still is a badass.
Still is a badass. She retired, but she's still a badass in retirement. But I remember watching her up on the screen, and she's reporting, I got to talk to so-and-so. They're kind of storming this place. The embassy's secure, but this is our take, and this is what we should do. And I thought, wow, I'm so lucky that I've had the opportunity to work in the White House on domestic policy and economic policy and budget policy. But man, maybe I really missed out on foreign policy. This is so exciting. And then 2 years later, I'm walking in with the Secretary of State to help him run the place. And I felt like a fraud completely. And the only things that gave me real confidence was that I knew I was there because I knew John Kerry and I knew the White House, I knew Barack Obama, and my job was to help put all those pieces together.
Right. I think I was in that meeting. She was essentially barricaded in the embassy with millions of people marching.
Yes.
I remember walking up being how is she not scared shitless? And I was like, oh wait, she was ambassador to Pakistan, I believe, before.
And
this.
she was
she's
just
kinda used to this.
so this is what we're going to do, and this is who I'm going to talk to, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Whereas we would all be no, let's go home.
I would do anything that woman told me to do.
She's
I'd be
amazing.
okay, we're good. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you got promoted to the Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources. Back to the sort of idea of process and management and making things actually work. Can you tell us a little bit about what that job entails?
So it's a unique role across the federal agencies. The State Department is the only department that has had two deputies. And it doesn't seem likely that Secretary Tillerson is going to fill the role that I held, which I think is too bad, not because it has anything to do with myself, but because the State Department has a completely complex platform of 270 posts around the world where we have our diplomats and our locally engaged staff where we're executing our mission. I mean, in almost every single country, there's just a few countries we can't or aren't in. And you have security, you have operational aspects of that. We issue all of the passports, all the visas. We admit, or I should say past tense. It's only been a few weeks.
I know.
We administer
get used to it.
The refugee admissions program. I mean, not to mention the day-to-day diplomacy. I mean, it is a huge mission. And you also have a department in which the secretary is traveling, constantly. Certainly Secretary Kerry was, Secretary Clinton did. That's the model. And the other deputy has major travel responsibilities, diplomatic responsibilities, as did I. And so really my job was to make sure this complex platform could function well, but also that we were improving and becoming more efficient and more effective, that we had a very good, big part of my role was to oversee our $50 billion budget. So that included $30 billion in foreign assistance, everything we did around the world, but making sure we were executing in a way that continually just extended our impact and our reach in a world that is more and more complex to operate in. So I did a lot of stuff internally. I looked, paid a lot of attention to what was going on overseas at our posts and was able to focus a lot on development issues and that, ranged from our HIV/AIDS programs to our refugee work. And it's unique, but I actually think for the State Department, it's a really important role. So I'm sorry they're not likely to fill it in this moment, but I think that it made the department a much more responsive place to things like, embassy security and Freedom of Information Act requests.
Yeah, I have a sense that they're going to learn very quickly that having competent people in place at senior levels is not, it is essential. It is not a luxury. It is essential.
Totally.
You mentioned refugees, and there's been a lot of discussion in the news lately about refugees. What's unfortunate, I think, is almost always in the context of terrorism. And sort of paints all refugees as potential terrorists, which misses the point, I think, that we're a nation of immigrants. We are at our best when we care for people in need. You spent a lot of time working on these issues at state, including you actually helped quarterback a summit with President Obama on refugee issues. Was that at the UN?
Yeah, it was on the margins of the UN General Assembly, yeah.
I was wondering if you could tell us about that experience, like people you met, because I don't know. I just want people to understand why we do this.
Mm-hmm. Today I was reading the paper and there was this, I think, rather extraordinary full-page ad in the Washington Post that was taken out by evangelical leaders from all 50 states, leading evangelical leaders, basically urging the president and the vice president to be on the side of refugees. And that speaks to the tradition in this country of faith-based organizations leading the effort to support and assimilate refugees into our country. And in this rather extraordinary full-page ad, they talked about, of course, Christians overseas have been persecuted, but so have Muslims, and so have people of no faith. And it is our role, and it is our tradition, and it is our history to help those people. And to me, the very jarring aspect of the transition between President Obama and President Trump on refugees is that President Obama led a global effort to get other countries to live up to the tradition of the United States of America, to welcome the most vulnerable, to provide humanitarian assistance, to look for opportunities to provide people who are permanently or, for a very significant amount of time displaced with educational and employment opportunities to live up to their potential, which is a tradition of this country. And within days of this presidency, we are questioning whether that is who we are.
Yeah.
And that's why I am heartened by the protests we've seen at airports and around the country, because you see people saying, no, that is how we are. That is who we are. And not just from, people maybe who would have supported Secretary Clinton or who didn't support President Trump, but from Christian conservatives, from people of all faiths. There's a network of 350 organizations around this country whose mission it is to resettle refugees. I mean, that is incredible. They are in every state. They're in so many metropolitan areas. They come together in faith communities. They sponsor families. They outfit apartments. They get cribs. They help people enroll in schools. They learn languages. And what President Obama did with the Refugee Summit was get over 50 nations to do more. Resettle refugees, give more money, provide those opportunities. And he was leading a global response. And because we're in the most critical refugee crisis since at least the Second World War, we need a leader like that. And it was hard to get all of the different agencies of government to reach the goals that he set for us. And it was very difficult for the State Department to do the diplomacy to get so many other countries to go further. But we did it. And we really exceeded the goals that the president set for us. And it's really painful to think that we would in some way backtrack from that. And it's painful in the aggregate when you just think of the numbers. But when you meet people, I was in Lesbos, Greece, which is an island where a lot of migrants come, refugees come from Turkey. And I met with folks in a processing center who were hoping to emigrate and to lots of different places. And I met with this one man, and his wife and his children had all been murdered. And he was alone, and he had to leave because he had nowhere to go. And he didn't necessarily want to come to the United States. He just wanted to be safe. And that is the kind of sanctuary this country has provided. And so, it's really jarring to go from having a president who is saying to the world, this is our moment to step up, to a president who's saying our doors are closed.
Yeah. I don't think it's a partisan statement to say we should have more empathy for others and at least try to talk about that element of this crisis because, If you were upset and you cried when you saw that picture of a little boy dead on a beach in Greece or in Turkey, or
I can't even look at that picture.
It's
He looks just like my son. I literally can't look at that picture. Devastating.
It is devastating. And so for people listening who I would never criticize someone for being concerned about terrorism. You are well within your right. And we as former government officials should be worried about that too. But I'm wondering what, someone who's an expert in this, I wonder what you could tell them about the vetting process or the general approach that might make them feel better.
Yeah, I'm completely sympathetic to people who say, man, that sounds scary, Let's not have people come in. I remember there was a period a couple of years ago when a lot of governors were saying they were going to take their states out of the refugee resettlement program. And we were very engaged at the State Department in educating governors and members of Congress and the general public about the vetting process. And I saw on my Facebook page this woman I went to high school with who was a really lovely person, very compassionate, and she'd posted something, I feel terrible myself, but I'm scared, and I don't want these people coming to my town.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, boy, that encapsulates the fear that I think is real and genuine, and we have to answer. And I did respond to her, and I responded to her in the same way that we did with members of Congress, and we were in this all-senator briefing. It's the most incredible one I've ever been to. I think every senator was there except for those who are running for president, Rubio and Cruz and others. And we went through it. We said, refugees are the most thoroughly vetted of any travelers to the United States of America.
Period.
Globally, only 1% of refugees are resettled in a third country.
Wow.
The United States of America has prioritization for who we bring here.
Mm-hmm.
They are women and children. They are people who are ill or have been persecuted. They are not generally men of fighting age who come here.
Yeah.
It is – so you're already taking this large population, you're skinning it way down, and then you're taking the most vulnerable populations. And then you are subjecting them to an 18 to 24-month-long process that is incredibly rigorous. They start with a UN screening process, then a U.S. screening process, then an interview, biometric. They go through a multi-agency background check that involves nearly every part
the
of
FBI, the National Counterterrorism Center. Yeah, it's not just squishy eggheads at state, right? This is some nail-biting intel guys.
Every agency in the intelligence community who has a database is involved in this process. And let me tell you something. The people at the State Department, and this is certainly true for the intelligence community, but I'll speak for the State Department, the people who run this program, the last thing on earth they want is for somebody to get into this country with malintent, because they know it would have the impact of shutting the program down.
Right.
And the members of the intel community who do this work, that is their job. Their job is to keep dangerous people out of this country. So I'd argue that we have extreme vetting now. But there's not any fiber in my being or anyone else who's worked on this issue who, if someone said, I have another idea for a database to check or a process to do, who would say, we don't want to do that. Mm-hmm. We really, when we look at this closely, we say we're doing everything we know how to do. And by the way, it's working. We've never had an attack or a potential attack, despite what you've read. Maybe there's been some alleged massacres.
Yeah.
But it hasn't happened. So,
right.
It is really a misguided discussion, but there's real fear, and that has to be addressed. And there's real facts out there. And I think it's hard for people to hear those because there's so much noise, but it's important to try to communicate that.
So emotional. You're listening to Pod Save the World. Stick around. There's more great show coming your way. Movement Watches was founded on the belief that style shouldn't break the bank. The watchmaker's goal is to change the way consumers think about fashion by offering high-quality, minimalist products at revolutionary prices. With over 1 million watches sold to customers in 160-plus countries around the world, Movement Watches has solidified itself as the world's fastest-growing watch company. Every member of the Crooked Media team has a Movement watch, and I can tell you that they look great. They fit well, they look good, you're going to love them. Movement watches start at just $95. At a department store, you're looking at like $400 or $500 a piece. The team at Movement Watches figured out that by selling online, they were able to cut out the middleman and the retail markup and provide you with the best possible price. Get 15% off today with free shipping and free returns by going to mvmtwatches.com/crookedworld. That's mvmtwatches.com/crookedworld. Join the movement. Pod Save the World is also brought to you by Squarespace. If you've ever tried to start your own website, you know what a hassle it can be, especially if you don't know what you're doing. Make your next move, make your next website with Squarespace. You can create a beautiful website with Squarespace's all-in-one platform. There's nothing to install, patch, or upgrade ever. Squarespace provides award-winning 24/7 customer support and will help you get your own custom domain with an experience that's fully transparent and simple to set up. Make your next move, lock down your domain, and create a website to launch that idea. Use offer code SAVETHEWORLD for 10% off of your first purchase of a website or domain. That's Save the World for 10% off of your first purchase of a website or domain with Squarespace. I learned a very cool term recently, which is a Dissent channel. There is a report, obviously President Trump has put forward a ban of Muslims from 7 countries.
You call it a ban?
It's a ban. Yeah, you called it a ban. But there was some reports that there's something called the Dissent channel at the State Department, which is an opportunity for State Department employees to offer a view that disagrees with the secretary or the leadership at the time. They don't get in trouble. People read it. It's their sort of avenue, which is very cool, frankly, and should be replicated across government, in my opinion. But I'm wondering, what you make of those reports, what you make of the Dissent channel, or I don't know. It's such a fascinating thing that occurred. It is
fascinating. So I learned about it when I was at the State Department because it is unique in government. Right. No other agency has it. And I do think it would be healthy to have it in some other agencies.
It's ballsy. You're wrong, boss.
It is, And look, the State Department is the most hierarchical place in the federal government, perhaps, right? And so for somebody to be able to say, I disagree, and this message is going to get to the Secretary of State, it is a big deal. So it's not used. It's not like people do this every day. Right? So when I was at the State Department with Secretary Kerry, there was a Dissent channel cable about our Syria policy. It was signed by 51 members of the Foreign Service, which was the second largest before the 1,000 plus who just signed the most recent one. And, Secretary Kerry took that very seriously. He respected it. I mean, he cut his teeth in politics by protesting the Vietnam War that he had fought in. So he certainly understood the importance of hearing from people in these positions. He convened a meeting with these folks, and he heard them out, and he explained, the policy and talked about it. It was really, really important. And what I think is very significant about the Dissent channel cable about the Muslim ban is that you saw such a widespread endorsement of the position. People who really felt like it was more important to weigh in against this policy than it was to be concerned about having signed on. And then the response from the White House was disconcerting. Right. It basically said, if you don't like the policy, you can, you can leave. And if you lost 1,000 Foreign Service officers with the amount of experience that people who signed that cable had, our diplomacy and our national security would really be at risk. So my hope is that, that was just a reaction. Secretary Tillerson will come in. This will be a channel that's respected, because it's important to keep people on board, and part of keeping them on board is giving them an opportunity to express their views.
I mean, you said something that I think people don't realize about the State Department in particular is how many people who work there are career Foreign Service officers who have served Republicans, who've served Democrats, who will be there when we showed up and will be there long after we're gone. How do you go from an Obama administration employee to a Trump administration? I mean, are you hearing from people that they have whiplash?
So interesting. Used to it? So even before the election, just maybe because my horizon was the end of the Obama administration and the end of Kerry's tenure, I was very focused on transition. And some of the career Foreign Service officers that I served with said, we're kind of used to transition. Mm-hmm. We go back and forth. We do this. We sign up for this life. We've signed up for this agency. We serve overseas. We're here in Washington. We're all around the world. We're used to this, Mm-hmm. Foreign policy is not political. Yeah, you have different positions, but this is about the United States' role in the world. This was different. This was definitely different. And I think it was different in part because the transition itself was a little abnormal. I think it's safe to say that they weren't expecting to take over. And so they're a little bit behind the ball. And that's okay, I think anybody in their position might have been. Mm-hmm. But then, the Secretary Tillerson didn't come into the building until the day that he was confirmed. He didn't meet with John Kerry.
Really?
I think that is.
It's crazy.
I think it's insane.
Why not get Trump met with Obama?
It's like, so the transition landing teams would come around and meet with us and sort of take notes and so forth. But it's like they didn't they're afraid we might be contagious or something. I don't know. I mean, it was very strange. So I think for people within the building who are used to transition, who are a little jarred by the tone of the president-elect and then the president about U.S. foreign policy and our role in the world, were even more disconcerted by the fact that this wasn't a transition that you could really understand. You couldn't get to know the people. You couldn't do your briefing in a way that might resonate with the secretary, just to tell him what's going on. Like, I guarantee you, if President Trump had known about the deal with Australia, which I helped negotiate, on the refugees, he would have had a different reaction. He might not have embraced it, but
he might not have shouted down the prime minister.
He might have known that was coming in the conversation, right? Like, there's just no way.
It's just bad staff work, by the way.
Bad. I mean, it's inconceivable to think that that wasn't going to come up, or that he didn't have that paper in front of him. And it's not because, I mean, I guarantee there's like 18 papers that people wrote at the State Department, like making sure that he could have been aware of that, but they didn't know. And all the, but if you had a transition that was trying to make sure all of this was seamless and a White House that was receptive to it, I think that would have been really maybe better handled. So back to the Foreign Service, I think that, they're encouraged by the tone that Secretary Tillerson is taking, and the fact that he has an appreciation for what at least a global company has to role they play that is not dissimilar. It is different, but it is not dissimilar to having a global U.S. perspective. But they're jarred by what's happened over the last 2 to 3 weeks. And the other thing that when I leave the State Department, I'm very humbled by the sacrifices that diplomats make, and I feel like it's something that's very underappreciated, and it's sort of people have this impression of diplomats being wine sipping, kind of erudite, and a lot of people are extremely smart and talented and the cream of the crop. But these are people who are going to war zones. They're separated from their families. They're hauling their kids all around the world into sort of questionable schools. They're women and men who are potentially separated from their spouses, and it's real sacrifice. And they do it because they understand these are the building blocks to peace and to forging a stronger U.S. national security and foreign policy. And I really am changed by having served with those people.
Real sacrifice and real risk, and they do it unarmed.
That's right.
And we need to take care of them. You talked about the global nature of the job you had and of the department. The tough thing about being the United States is there's a global crisis, you're in charge, right? You had to lead global responses to 2 terrifying pandemic diseases, starting with Ebola. How in the world do you begin to figure out how to lead a crisis of something like Ebola? And how infuriating is it when you see your own media and your own government making it harder by demagoguing these things?
Yeah, well, so I had the lead role at the State Department for our response, but it was a multi-agency response. But, I think we created an opening, frankly, because the multilateral institutions like the World Health Organization and other groups, we didn't respond. The U.S. government didn't respond initially as well as we needed to. But I'll tell you something. Once the United States government got itself together, in other words, we understood how we would work and what we would do, and that it was going to require our leadership, and we weren't going to depend on other institutions to lead. I've never seen anything like it. For everyone from the U.S. military to the Centers for Disease Control, obviously to the folks at USAID who do so much of the incredible work on the ground, to the work at the State Department that was all about diplomacy and getting other governments to respond. And we simply would not have contained Ebola without the United States of America.
And heroic work.
Heroic work. And
can you imagine being on the ground in Western Africa during this?
It's funny. I was in Liberia in June of that year. So Ebola had broken out, but it wasn't it really hit in August. And it wasn't an issue people were really talking about in any sort of significant way. And so I was really consumed with, man, there's so many challenges in this country. For everything from how do you get, they had this horrible civil war. So they're building all these schools, but they don't have teachers who are literate. Everything was so overwhelming. And then Ebola hits and the public health infrastructure crumbles. People can't go to school. They can't even go to the schools where the teachers don't actually know how to read or write. It's just devastating to this country. And without the United States of America and its partners public, private, other governments, multilateral, but without our leadership, we wouldn't have contained that disease, and they wouldn't now be starting forward again on that path. And they had their own leadership, and they were great partners within Liberia, but it was essential for the U.S. to lead. And we had the only plane, the State Department had the only plane that could evacuate health professionals from West Africa affected by Ebola. And we couldn't convince other health professionals, French speakers, people from other countries, to go if they didn't think they could get evacuated.
Right.
And we had one plane that could evacuate one person. Oh. And it was incredible that we had that resource. It was in reserve. But we then took that and said, okay, this is a challenge. We partnered with the private sector, with a foundation. And just a couple of months ago, I went out to Dulles as part of this exercise. And they had the box. It's a containerized biocontainment solution. It's not this box. They can take 4 people from anywhere in the world, load it into lots of different types of airplanes, have health professionals going in and out to treat them. And, again, that's the United States saying, this is a problem we saw with Ebola. We're ready for the next one. And, that is really inspiring stuff.
Yeah. God bless the people who are smart enough to invent those things.
It's like boggles your mind when you get into the details.
Yeah. So going from a crisis that got a lot of media attention and understandably scared the life out of people to Zika, which really frightens me because I feel like this hasn't gotten the attention it needs, not for lack of trying from the administration, but I think this could be a ticking time bomb where there's an untold cost for millions of babies and people around the world who are infected. What do you think people need to know, and what could they do maybe in their own lives that could help get us ahead of the curve on this?
Yeah. So with Zika, I remember Dr. Frieden, who was the head of the Centers for Disease Control, we were in a meeting, and he said, He's very intense and he's super smart, and he drops all this medical knowledge, and you're sort of like, whoa. And he said, the difference between Ebola and Zika is that we had known unknowns with Ebola. We knew what we were trying to figure out. He said, with Zika, we have unknown unknowns. He said, we are learning more every day. We don't know what's coming next. We only know what we've seen so far, and we are very cognizant of the fact that we're not sure where this thing is going. And that really scared me because I was pretty frightened during our Ebola, medical briefings, not because I thought it was going to, really hit the United States in quite the way that the press suggested.
Right.
By the way, I feel like we can't talk about Ebola without saying Ron Klain is a hero.
Yes, he is.
And the absolute, savior of West Africa for making the U.S. government function as well as it did respond in the way it did.
Ron Klain, he was a longtime Biden aide, who's on every debate prep for Obama, was just a brilliant lawyer, came in and just ran the point on the response.
He's
out of the
one
House.
who made the U.S. government respond in the way it did to stop that. But in any event,
we'll call him a friend of the pod.
Friend of the
pond,
pond, but he'll come. I promise that.
Cool.
Okay, so Zika, that was really chilling to me because we were doing everything that we knew how to do. Or we are. I hope still. But it was, whether it was vaccines or what kind of vector control, that means, either covering your body or spraying and all these sorts of things, and the sort of prevention. But at the same time, we're learning more about the disease, how it was transmitted, when you should travel, when you shouldn't. It was really sort of chilling. And so I think you're exactly right. You spend 3 weeks reading headlines in the paper predominantly about countries in South America that are affected by this disease, but not fully appreciating the impact. And I think that while there was a pretty moderate impact domestically, this isn't over. This is like an evil mosquito.
Yeah.
And we don't understand the disease, and so we can't let the news cycles and the press attention guide science and resources and sound public policy decisions. And that was one of the things that was really kind of concerning about Ebola, because if we had followed the direction of press attention, we would have, or U.S. panic.
Right.
We would have taken our eye off the ball.
We would have shut down airports. We would have had people lying and traveling.
Wouldn't have done
the United
anything.
States.
We would have put all our energy there. Wouldn't have done anything. With Zika, we have to keep that focus. And it's not just Zika. It's how this mosquito will continue to. With climate change, you're going to see, disease moving in different ways. You're going to see more urbanization, more concentration of people, disease spreading. So like we have to have these muscles flexing well, right? And they can't be driven by U.S. panic or fear.
Right. The Zika virus, I think, emerged in a jungle in the middle of Africa and somehow got connected to a mosquito native to Egypt, and thanks to global travel, now it's here.
That's right. I mean, that's the nature of global travel, and because we have these other kind of global trends, whether it's climate change or other, like it's going to keep happening more and more frequently, and so we can't just sort of be like we only care when it's we think it might come to the United States because it can. All these diseases can.
And you shouldn't just care if you're a woman who's pregnant or thinking you might get pregnant. Microcephaly might not be the end of the problems with Zika.
Because we're still learning. Unknown unknowns.
You're geeking out with me on Pod Save the World. More on the way. Not all ingredients are created equal. Fresh, high-quality ingredients make a real difference, so it's important to know where your food comes from. I've been using Blue Apron for years, and that's because the food tastes great, it's fun and easy to do, and it's affordable. For less than $10 per person per meal, Blue Apron delivers seasonal recipes along with pre-portioned ingredients to make delicious, home-cooked meals. You can choose from a variety of new recipes each week, or let Blue Apron's culinary team surprise you. Recipes are not repeated within a year, so you'll never get bored. And there's no weekly commitment, so you only get deliveries when you want them. Each meal comes with a step-by-step, easy-to-follow recipe card and pre-portioned ingredients that can be prepared in 40 minutes or less. Check out this week's menu and get your first 3 meals free with free shipping by going to blueapron.com/crookedworld. That's blueapron.com/crookedworld. You will love how good it feels and tastes to create incredible home-cooked meals with Blue Apron, so don't wait. That's blueapron.com/crookedworld. Blue Apron, a better way to cook. Pod Save the World is also brought to you by Tommy John Underwear. Over the years, we upgrade so many things. Cars, phones, TVs. When was the last time you upgraded your underwear? Yeah, your underwear. I want to tell you about Tommy John. Not the surgery, the revolutionary men's underwear brand that has redefined comfort for guys everywhere, myself included. Love it is creeping over me during this ad.
I just don't know why it's necessary to record the ad in your underwear.
Each pair is crafted from an ultra-lightweight fabric for maximum breathability. The legs never ride up, the waistband never rolls down. Tommy John's patented 21st century design even makes it impossible to get a wedgie. I find that hard to believe. Look, I've tried all kinds of different underwear brands trying to find the perfect fit. Tommy John's is simply the best there is, and they've got a lot more than unbelievable underwear. Their undershirts go on like a second skin and never come off untucked. Even their socks are engineered to stay up all day. And all of Tommy John's underwear is backed by the best pair you'll ever wear or its free guarantee. Tommy John, no adjustment needed. Hurry to TommyJohn.com/world to experience life-changing comfort and get 20% off your first order. That's TommyJohn.com/world for 20% off your order. TommyJohn.com/world. You're going to love it. You were the first woman to hold the position of Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources. And so first of all, congratulations. You're a badass and a role model for all the people listening. But second, while there are incredibly powerful women in foreign policy like Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, Madeleine Albright, Lisa Monaco, I would say if you look across the totality of national security world, so states a little better. States like 40 some odd percent, but only 30 some odd percent in senior foreign service, right? But if you look at state, DOD, the intelligence community, women are underrepresented. Women are underrepresented on Pod Save the World right now. I'm working on that. That's more of a booking sequencing issue for all the people out there who are going to call me on this. But I'm wondering if you have a sense of why that is and what you tell young women listening about why they specifically are needed in these jobs.
So the first thing I would say is, for in Obama administration, in a Kerry Secretary of State, as Secretary of State, it wasn't hard to get talented women who were powerful and qualified into key roles, right? Like they're out there, right?
Ann Patterson.
She's great. I'm talking about like some of the political appointments that were made. Like when I came in the State Department with Kerry, I mean, admittedly, I helped him with this, but we had the vast majority of assistant secretaries, undersecretaries. Obviously, we had 2 deputies, one of which was a woman, me. That wasn't hard. It wasn't hard to find good people to do those things, right? But it is harder in these career roles because you're not being, appointed to something. You're coming up through the ranks.
Right.
So in the Foreign Service, until around the time, I think it was the early 70s, there was this, you weren't allowed to be married as a woman in the Foreign Service. It was like prohibited, right? It's crazy. So anyhow, that's changed, and there's more and more women, and it's getting to be closer to parity in terms of the classes that are coming in. But to achieve rank of ambassador, to reach the highest levels of the Foreign Service, it takes a long time. 20 to 30 years, right, to really go through all these steps. And so the highest levels of the Foreign Service, senior Foreign Service, It's like 25, 30%. It's horrible. I mean, I was shocked when I saw this data. So it's something that Secretary Kerry wanted to focus on. It's something I spent time on, really paying attention to and appreciating that we're bringing cohorts of people in, but it's incumbent upon the organization to make sure they stay in and they succeed, not to help them in ways that are somehow privileging them, but to really say, we need you. We need your voices. We need your leadership here. And there's terrific examples across the State Department. But if you take your eye off that ball, you'll lose people, because it is a hard place to work, because some of the things we were talking about before, you got to take your family all around the world. If you decide to have a family, you're in dangerous places. You go on unaccompanied tours more and more because of the changing nature of the threat. So I spent a lot of time trying to focus on some of those issues and designing programs that would really be responsive and make sure we had the right mentorship and encouragement. But the bottom line is some of the greatest leaders at the department who were career, both foreign and civil service, are women. They're respected across the board, and they're more and more driving the policy at the State Department. And so anybody who's interested in these fields should be encouraged by that. And I would, strongly encourage the State Department and other foreign policy agencies national security agencies to be paying attention to that data. Like, look at the data, make it transparent, and be accountable to it, because it's not accidental. It's not. And when I think about sitting around the National Security Council table, in my tenure at the State Department, it was either Susan Rice, Avril Haines, or Lisa Monaco leading my meetings. Right. And they were and are respected, not because Barack Obama put them in those positions, but because they were badass and are smart and knew their shit and didn't let anything go. And I respect the hell out of all of them. And I didn't care they were women. And I don't think they cared that I was a woman.
You know who else didn't care? The chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff.
That's right.
The people who you think
That's right.
might have a beef, they never did.
It was like the very first time I remember Ben Rhodes was sitting at the table. The first time I sat at the principals table of the National Security Council with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense. I was representing the Secretary of State, the head of the CIA, DNI, like whatever. And Ben looked over at me like, hey, you're here. And he wasn't like, hey, you're here and you're a woman. He was like, isn't this amazing? Right? Like, we're sitting here with some of the badasses of our government doing important work, and that's the way it felt in that room. And I really, really hope that continues going forward, because I think that's the way we should be making decisions.
Me too. So transitioning from sort of women inside the State Department to sort of some of the work you guys did for women externally. You, along with the State Department Office of Global Women's Issues, you did amazing work with women to support women around the globe. How did gender equality become so important at State? Was that something that's been a long time priority, or is this something you guys worked to push?
Well, certainly Secretary Clinton really made it a priority. But when you look across the global landscape and you look at development and national security and foreign policy, everybody's kind of coalescing around the importance or the centrality of women and girls. And, I didn't come into this job as the first woman deputy secretary being like, I'm for women's issues. When you look at the data, you can't ignore how important it is to focus on the role of women and girls. If women and girls, but women are empowered economically, they provide income to their households. When they have an opportunity to get an education, they can earn an income. When they are not forced into early marriage, then they can go to school and make money. And when they have the opportunity to understand about family planning, spacing of children, that is not having to have them every single year, then they don't have as many children to take care of, and they can provide for their families, and they can help their families and their villages and their countries be out of the grip of poverty. And so when you look at this data and disproportionately where those factors are, you just have to look at women and girls. I had this I had a lot of opportunities to travel and sort of see this in action, but I was in Papua New Guinea, and I was absolutely shocked to learn that 70% of the women in PNG were subject to sexual or physical violence in their lives. 70%. And it's one of the poorest countries in the world, right? So these things are related. They're not accidental. Right. And I visited a clinic that had 7 beds, And it was one of 3 in the country, in the whole country, where women who had been severely physically or sexually violated could seek refuge. And this woman was telling me, she went to the police station and she was dripping in blood. Her skull had been fractured. They didn't help her because that's not the culture. Like, how can you think about a country really being able to escape the type of poverty and look for opportunity if that's what 70% of the women are dealing with, right? So it doesn't become like I think that, equal and human rights for women is important. I mean, I do, but it's just a basic element of how we bring countries up in terms of how they live and how they prosper. So it begins to focus your attention. And I think, one of the things that's so disconcerting to me about President Trump reinstating the global gag rule, which prohibits family planning organizations from even mentioning, from funding abortions with their private non-U.S. government resources, but even to mentioning it as an option, is that he expanded it to a much, much greater pool of funding. So in other words, before it was this pot of funding that was about $500 million that went for family planning. And if any of those organizations talked about abortion, they couldn't get U.S. funding. And now it goes to all global health funding. It's 15 times more funding. And to me, that's not about abortion. That's not about a domestic political issue.
Yeah.
That's about women being able to have sort of basic human rights that enable them to contribute to their families, their communities, and ultimately their countries.
How do you go from a conversation like you had with that woman at a clinic like that to a conversation with someone from the government in the country like that and not want to kill them? Right. Let me ask this a two-parter. I guess if you hear that story like I just did and you're horrified and you want to do something, what can people do in their own lives?
One of the things that I was encouraged by when I was on that visit is that our embassy was taking its relatively limited resources and creating support programs and engagements to expand those opportunities, right? Like, I think that's really important. But the bigger question you have, which I think is a more relevant one, is people who feel strongly about that. Like, what do they do? How do they really get engaged on these issues? There are so many international NGOs that are focused on addressing poverty issues globally, but really focusing on women and girls. And I think people should look for those and see if they can support them financially. There's things you can do. There's organizations that do water walks, for example, and they encourage like young people to walk and raise money for as long as like a girl in some country would have to do to get water every day. Like, there's lots of ways, if that's what you're interested or compelled by, to get engaged. But it's really about raising money. It's really about saying, how can we fund these programs that address some of these core issues, and caring about it and seeing that there's a real connection, not just to you because you feel compelled by it, but in really raising the standards for the way people live all around the world. I was in Madagascar, and there was this little van that did family planning services that the USAID helped fund that I went to visit. And it was one of the poorest countries in the entire world. And I was in this incredibly poor, I can't describe how poor it was like in a dump, this little community was. And I went and visited with some of the people, and this young woman, she was 17. She had a 2-year-old kid on her hip, and she was pregnant. And I said, what does it mean to you to hear the presentation you heard? What do you think about this? And she said, I had no idea I could control this.
Wow.
So she got pregnant when she was 14. She was about to have her second child. And she didn't know until that, kind of crappy little van and this dump came to say, there's a way to at least space your pregnancies. We can't fund those organizations anymore. And to me, that is devastating.
And that is a sense of empathy and understanding someone's perspective. I don't know that you could possibly realize – I couldn't wrap my head around that someone could think that way unless you met them and had that conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
overwhelming.
It's overwhelming. You have been incredibly gracious with your time. I want to ask you one last question because I was so struck the other day when I saw a photo or a video of Secretary Kerry just walking his dog in the Women's March. And I thought about the political career he has had and how bruising and awful it was at times when he was savaged by the Swiftboat veterans. And you've known him for like the entirety of that. I'm just wondering if you have any reflections on working with him, on what you guys were able to accomplish together, and what he should do next.
Well, I wasn't with him the entirety because he obviously started his career right after he fought in Vietnam.
Right.
But I've been with him for a long time.
You were like a baby. You
I
weren't
was.
born yet.
I was born, but not paying attention to politics. But what I've thought about this a little bit because it was emotional for the administration to come to an end and my tenure at state, and with Secretary Kerry to come to an end after having begun in 1999 with him and 2007 with Barack Obama. And I thought about Kerry and I thought, to me, he's been so consistent, and I don't think that's how people think about it. That's how I think about it. He started his public life protesting a war he fought in. He was a pursuer of peace. When I think of all the knocks he's taken and the work that he's done, to me, he just keeps focused on what he wants to do and believing in it, and he is an indefatigable pursuer of peace. He is focused in a very serious way on fighting our enemies, and he doesn't actually care what people think about whether it's the smart political or the right thing to do. So being with him when he ran for president, like right after he announced he was going to run for president, he was diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah.
Like 2 weeks later, I can't remember the exact time frame, but it was really close. And he was like, all right, let's deal with this and let's go. That was really – and then we went through a bruising campaign, and it wasn't always, a positive experience. But I remember in December of 2003, we were at 12% in the polls. I remember Ted Kennedy had to come to our sad little campaign headquarters and give us a pep talk.
God, I miss him.
It was I'm sure he was thinking, oh, it'll all be over for you soon. But, but we won Iowa. And we won the nomination. And we lost the election. It sucked. It sucked to lose, and it sucked. I was sitting in his office the next week, Oh, man, that's painful. You go from being, almost president to back. He brushed it off. There were a few bad weeks. It was not pleasant. But then he was like, let's get focused, And he said, I really want to focus on climate change. And there were a lot of people around him who said, is that smart? I'm not sure that's the most politically. Right. He wrote a book about it. He was like, it became a New York Times bestseller. And of course, other people were talking about climate change, Al Gore, others. But he was like, this is the issue that matters. He went then, led the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was focused on that. I think he did a great job. And then it was incredibly fun to watch him at the State Department in his element, so engaged on these issues that were so hard. It wasn't always fun, but seeing him so committed and people doubting, oh, is it smart to pursue a Middle East peace deal? Is it, are you going to get an agreement with Cyprus? How do you keep going at, Lavrov on Syria? But the guy believes in peace. And he believes in fighting his enemies. And that's the way I think about him starting his career, and that's the way I think about him ending his public service career. And I got to tell you, I got tears in my eyes when I saw pictures of him with Ben, his dog, and he, on his first day as a private citizen, 33 years or more out there marching. And I'm telling you, nobody put this on his schedule. He had no schedule.
Right.
There was no scheduler. Yes. He just was like, let's go do this. And I was like, that's my guy, I just think he's fantastic. And I don't think he's always it's always written that way because it's a lot of complexity in the stuff that he's done, but that's how I feel about it.
Yeah. Politics is fickle and unfair, and you have a guy like John Kerry who was attacked as elitist not a touch, and we just elected a guy who shits on a gold leaf toilet on a populist message. But I'm so impressed by the people like him who, in the face of that adversity, just go back to work and grind it out. Yeah. Because he did a lot of good.
And they believe in this country. And they don't believe it's popularity contest. They believe it's about making this world safer and stronger.
Heather, thank you so much. This was so much fun. Thank you again.
Thank you. It's fun.